She was 48 years old, standing in a wedding dress she'd stitched with her own trembling hands, and the entire town of Copper Ridge wanted her to fail. They called her foolish. They called her desperate. They said a woman her age had no business wearing white, no business believing a man like Caleb Mercer could love her for anything other than convenience. But Eleanor Whitmore had spent 12 years hiding behind grief, and she was done. This is the story of how one woman burned down every wall the world built around her and dared to love again when everyone said it was too late. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this tale travels. The bell above the door hadn't rung in 3 days, and Eleanor Whitmore was starting to think the whole town had finally decided to forget about her completely. She sat behind the counter of her sewing shop on Main Street, a narrow building squeezed between the feed store and a vacant lot where somebody had once tried to build a barbershop and quit halfway through. The sign out front read, "Whitmore's Tailoring and Mending," in faded blue letters that had been peeling since the year her husband died, and she'd never bothered to repaint them. Repainting would have meant she cared about the future, and for a long time Eleanor hadn't been sure she did. The morning light came through the front window at an angle that made the dust motes look like tiny insects drifting through syrup. She watched them float while her fingers worked automatically on the hem of a rancher's wife's Sunday dress. Mrs. Calloway's, a woman who hadn't said a kind word to Eleanor in 6 years, but still brought her mending because Eleanor was cheap and fast and never gossiped about the stains. "You look tired," she told herself, catching her reflection in the glass display case where she kept her nicer thread. The face staring back was gaunt, lined around the mouth, with streaks of gray running through hair that had once been the color of dark honey. She looked away. She always looked away. The shop smelled like cotton dust and iron, and the faint lingering sweetness of the lavender sachets she tucked into customers' packages. A small kindness nobody ever thanked her for. The floorboards creaked when she shifted her weight, and the back wall had a crack running from ceiling to floor that she'd been meaning to patch since winter. She hadn't patched it. She hadn't done a lot of things. Outside, Copper Ridge was waking up the way it always did. Slowly, reluctantly, like a dog that didn't want to leave its spot in the shade. She could hear the blacksmith's hammer starting up 2 blocks over, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang that marked the hours better than any clock. Horses passed on the packed dirt street. Someone was yelling at someone else about a water bill. The same sounds, the same morning, the same everything. Eleanor's husband Thomas had been dead for 12 years, 3 months, and roughly 14 days. She'd stopped counting the exact days about 4 years back when she realized the counting wasn't grief anymore. It was just habit, like cracking her knuckles or checking the lock twice before bed. Thomas had been a decent man. Not a great man, not a terrible one. He'd worked at the lumber mill east of town, came home smelling like sawdust and sweat, ate whatever she put in front of him, and told her she was pretty on Sundays when he'd had a bit of whiskey. He died of a fever that took him in 9 days and left Eleanor with a paid-off shop, $62 in savings, and a silence so vast she sometimes forgot what her own voice sounded like. She'd mourned him properly. A full year in black, the way women were supposed to. Then she'd kept wearing dark colors anyway because they were practical and because bright things felt like lies. The bell rang. Eleanor looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. The light shifted as the door opened, and for a second all she saw was a silhouette. Broad shoulders, a hat pulled low, the outline of a man who filled the doorframe in a way that made the shop feel suddenly smaller. "Morning," the man said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel being dragged across wood. "I'm looking to get some shirts mended, if you do that sort of thing." "I do that sort of thing," Eleanor said, and her voice came out flatter than she intended, the way it always did with strangers. She set down Mrs. Calloway's dress and wiped her hands on her apron, even though they weren't dirty. "Bring them to the counter." He stepped inside and the light caught him properly. He was tall, 6 feet, and then some, with a weathered face that looked like it had been left out in the sun and wind for about 50 years. His hair was dark with silver running through it, cut short but not neatly, like he'd done it himself with a hunting knife and a piece of broken mirror. His eyes were gray, not the pale, washed-out gray of old dishwater, but a deep storm gray, the color of clouds right before they break open. His hands, she noticed as he set a bundle of shirts on the counter, were scarred across the knuckles. Old scars, healed white. "Name's Caleb Mercer," he said. Just bought the Dawson property out past the canyon, the ranch. Eleanor nodded slowly. She'd heard about the Dawson place selling. Everyone had. It had sat empty for 2 years after old Walt Dawson drank himself to death, and the land had gone to seed, fences down, barn roof caving in, pastures choked with thistle. Nobody local had wanted it because nobody local had the money or the stubbornness to fix it up. You bought the Dawson place, she repeated, looking at him more carefully now. He didn't look like a fool, but then again, fools rarely did. That's a lot of broken fence for one man. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. I've got experience with broken things, he said. She untied the bundle and spread the shirts across the counter. 3 of them, all cottonwork shirts, all in rough shape. One had a torn sleeve, one was missing 2 buttons, and the third had a rip along the back seam that looked like it had been done by barbed wire. These have seen some trouble, she said. So have I. She looked up at him, and for a moment something passed between them that she couldn't name. A recognition, maybe, or just the mutual acknowledgement of 2 people who had been through enough to stop pretending everything was fine. Then the moment broke because the bell rang again, and Martha Pruitt came bustling in with a basket of linens and a voice loud enough to scare cattle. Eleanor, I need those curtains hemmed by Thursday because Howard's mother is coming, and you know she judges everything. Honestly, that woman could find fault with... Martha stopped mid-sentence when she saw Caleb. Her eyes went wide, then narrow, then calculating in the span of about 2 seconds. Well, hello there. Ma'am, Caleb said, touching the brim of his hat. Martha looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the shirts. Nobody said anything for a beat too long. Martha, I'll have your curtains done by Wednesday, Eleanor said, taking the basket without making eye contact. You can pick them up after lunch. Who's your friend? Martha asked, not bothering to lower her voice. Martha Pruitt had never lowered her voice in her life. Customer, Eleanor said. Mr. Mercer, your shirts will be ready tomorrow afternoon. That'll be 75 cents for the lot. Fair enough? He put 3 quarters on the counter, touched his hat again, and walked out. The bell rang behind him, and the shop felt bigger again, emptier, the way a room feels after someone takes a candle out of it. Martha was staring at her. That's the man who bought the Dawson Ranch? Apparently. He's handsome. He's a customer, Martha. A handsome customer. And you blushed. I did not blush. I'm 48 years old. I don't blush. You blush like a schoolgirl, Martha said with a grin that had too many teeth in it. Your cheeks went pink as a sunrise. Get out of my shop, Martha. Martha laughed all the way to the door, and the sound of it lingered in the air like smoke after Eleanor was alone again. She stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on one of Caleb Mercer's torn shirts, feeling the rough cotton under her fingers, and trying to remember the last time a man had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen something worth looking at. She couldn't remember, and that, she decided, was reason enough to stop thinking about it. But she didn't stop thinking about it. She mended his shirts that evening by lamplight, sitting in the back room of her shop where she also slept, ate, and spent most of her waking hours. The room was small and functional. A narrow bed against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, a table where she took her meals and did her fine work. She owned very little. A few dresses, her sewing tools, a stack of books she'd read twice each, and a tin box under the bed that held Thomas's pocket watch and their wedding photograph, which she hadn't looked at in years. She worked on the torn sleeve first, reinforcing the seam so it would hold up to hard use. She did good work. That was the one thing she'd never doubted about herself. Her stitches were small and even and strong, and she took a quiet pride in the fact that anything she mended stayed mended. There was a kind of honesty in that, she thought, in making broken things whole and sending them back out into the world to get broken again. The shirt smelled like horse sweat and sage and something else. Wood smoke, maybe, or leather. A working man's smell. She held it up to the lamp and examined the weave, and her fingers brushed the collar, and she caught herself wondering what the skin of his neck looked like beneath it. And then she put the shirt down and said, "Stop that," out loud to the empty room. She was being ridiculous. She knew she was being ridiculous. Men didn't look at women like her with anything other than mild acknowledgement, the same way they looked at fence posts or hitching rails, things that served a purpose and didn't require further thought. That was the truth of being a middle-aged widow in a frontier town. You became furniture. You became part of the landscape. You were there, and people used you when they needed you, and the rest of the time you were invisible. Caleb Mercer picked up his shirts the next afternoon. He came in just before closing, when the light was going gold through the window and Eleanor was sweeping the floor with her hair pinned up messily and a smudge of thread lint on her cheek. "These look good," he said, examining the mending. He ran his thumb along the repaired seam of the sleeve. "Real good. You've got steady hands." "Years of practice," she said, leaning on her broom. He looked at her for a moment, just looked. Not the quick up-and-down glance that men gave pretty young women, but a slow, steady regard that took in her face, her hands, the tired set of her shoulders. She felt seen in a way that was deeply uncomfortable and oddly wonderful at the same time. "I don't know many people in town yet," he said. "Been too busy pulling thistle and arguing with the well pump, but I figure I should ask, is there a place around here that serves decent food? The stuff I'm cooking for myself is liable to kill me before the winter does." Eleanor almost smiled. Almost. "May's Cookhouse, 2 blocks south. The stew is tolerable and the biscuits are good." Tolerable and good, that's a glowing endorsement. "It's Copper Ridge, we don't do glowing." This time she did smile, just barely, and she saw something in his gray eyes that might have been pleasure at having earned it. He thanked her, put on his hat, and left. And Eleanor stood in her empty shop with her broom and her smudged cheek and thought, very clearly and very deliberately, "I am not going to think about him." She thought about him constantly for the next 3 weeks. It wasn't dramatic or consuming. It was more like a low hum beneath the surface of her days, an awareness that hadn't been there before. She noticed when his horse was tied up outside the general store. She noticed when he passed her window on his way to the blacksmith. She noticed the sound of his boots on the boardwalk, which was stupid because boots all sounded the same, except somehow his didn't. He came back to her shop twice more in those 3 weeks, once to have a pair of trousers taken in at the waist. He'd lost weight during the move, he said, and once just to browse. He picked up a spool of red thread and turned it over in his scarred fingers and asked her what it was for. "Embroidery mostly," she said. "Decorative work." "You do decorative work?" When someone asks for it, which isn't often. People around here want things functional, not pretty. He set the spool down. "That's a shame. Seems like pretty things ought to exist just because they're pretty. Not everything has to be useful." She stared at him, and he stared back, and the silence between them lasted long enough that she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Then the bell rang because Harold Fenton needed a patch on his coat, and the moment dissolved like sugar in hot water. Spring turned to early summer, and the heat came down on Copper Ridge like a fist. The creek that ran along the south edge of town shrank to a trickle, and the dust got into everything. Clothes, food, lungs, dreams. Eleanor's shop was stifling by mid-afternoon, and she took to leaving the back door open to catch whatever breeze the canyon might send down. It was on one of those brutal June afternoons that Caleb Mercer showed up at her back door instead of her front one. He was holding a fistful of wildflowers, purple sage and Indian paintbrush, and some tiny yellow things she didn't know the name of, and he looked embarrassed in a way that didn't suit his face. "Found these along the canyon trail," he said, holding them out. "Figured they'd look better in here than dying in a ditch." Eleanor took the flowers. Their stems were warm from his hand. She held them awkwardly, like a woman who'd forgotten what to do with a gift. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Don't thank me. I nearly fell off my horse picking the yellow ones. Some gratitude I get. Horse tried to throw me into a ravine over a bunch of weeds." She laughed. It burst out of her before she could stop it. A real laugh. Not the polite half-smiles she handed out like change to customers. It was loud and graceless and surprised them both. Caleb grinned. It changed his whole face, cracking through the weathered seriousness of it and showing something younger underneath, something that hadn't been used in a long time. "I was wondering," he said, and then stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was wondering if you might want to come out to the ranch for supper sometime. I can't promise much, and I'm a terrible cook, and the house still smells like Walt Dawson's dog, but I've got a porch with a good view, and the evenings have been nice." Eleanor's first instinct was to say no. Her second instinct was also to say no. Her third instinct, which arrived about 2 seconds later, was to wonder why she always said no to everything and what exactly she was saving herself for. "I'll bring the food," she said. "You just make sure that porch is swept." She went on a Tuesday evening carrying a basket with cold chicken, bread, pickled vegetables, and a jar of plum preserves she'd been saving for nobody in particular. She'd changed her dress 3 times before settling on a dark blue one that was old but clean, and she'd let her hair down and then put it back up, and then taken it halfway down again before deciding she was acting insane and pinning it up firmly. The ride out to the Dawson place, the Mercer place now, she supposed, took about 40 minutes on the main road that wound through the canyon. The sun was dropping toward the ridgeline, and the light was doing that thing it did in summer where everything turned copper and amber, and the shadows stretched out long and thin across the land. She rode her old mare, Biscuit, who was 14 years old and unimpressed by scenery. The ranch was rougher than she'd expected, but better than she'd feared. The main house was a 2-story log and timber structure with a wide front porch and windows that somebody had recently cleaned. The barn behind it was patched but standing, and there were 3 horses in the corral and a vegetable garden along the south side that was struggling bravely against the heat. Caleb had been working. That was obvious. New fence posts lined the front pasture. The weeds had been beaten back, and there was fresh gravel on the path to the front door. He was sitting on the porch when she rode up, whittling something out of a piece of pine. He stood when he saw her, tucked the knife in his belt, and walked out to help her down from the horse, and his hand was warm and rough when it took hers, and she pretended that didn't matter. "Porch is swept," he said. "I can see that." They ate on the porch as the sun went down. The chicken was good and the bread was better, and Caleb declared the plum preserves the finest thing he'd tasted since leaving Colorado, which made Eleanor say, "You lived in Colorado," and opened a door into his past that he walked through slowly and carefully, like a man stepping across thin ice. He told her about the ranch he'd had outside of Durango, about the years he spent building it up from nothing, running cattle on high meadows, breaking horses in mountain winters that could freeze a man's blood in his veins, about his wife, Sarah, who'd been a school teacher before she married him, and who used to read him poetry at night, even though he told her it made him feel like a fool. She died in childbirth, he said, and his voice didn't break, but it flattened, the way a voice does when it's said something so many times the words have lost their edges. Her and the baby both, boy, would have been a boy. Eleanor said nothing for a while. She watched the last of the light drain out of the sky and listened to the crickets starting up in the grass. "Thomas, my husband, he died of a fever," she said finally. "It took 9 days, long enough to hope and short enough to feel like I'd been robbed." Caleb nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say it got better. He just nodded, and she understood the nod the way you understand a language you've always known, but never heard spoken aloud. "It meant I know. It meant I was there too. After Sarah," he said, "I sold the ranch. Couldn't look at the house anymore. Couldn't walk through rooms where she'd been. Spent about 6 years drifting. Worked cattle drives, hired out as a hand on other people's places. Kept moving because standing still felt like drowning. And now you're here. And now I'm here. Figured it was time to stop running from an empty house and try building one instead, even if it smells like Walt Dawson's dog." Eleanor snorted. "What happened to the dog?" "Harold Fenton took it, said he needed a Mauser. That dog doesn't know what a mouse is, it just sits on Harold's porch and barks at nothing. But Harold seems happy, so I didn't argue." They talked until the stars came out, thick and bright the way they only got this far from any real city. They talked about small things, the well pump that fought him every morning, the widow Patterson who brought him a pie that tasted like penance, the coyotes that sang him to sleep every night. And they talked about bigger things, the loneliness that settled into your bones like cold, the way grief could become so familiar it felt almost like company, the terrifying thought that maybe the best years were already behind them and everything from here on out was just waiting. "I don't believe that," Caleb said, and he was looking at her when he said it. "I used to, but I don't anymore." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been stuck for years suddenly giving way, a fraction of an inch. She didn't say anything. She wasn't ready to say anything, but she held the feeling carefully, the way you hold a match in the wind, knowing it could go out, afraid to breathe, hoping it wouldn't. She rode home in the dark with the stars overhead, and Biscuit picking her way carefully along the familiar road, and she lay awake in her narrow bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling and feeling, for the first time in more years than she could count, like there might be something worth waking up for tomorrow. The suppers became a regular thing. Every Tuesday and sometimes Saturday, Eleanor rode out to the Mercer Ranch with food, and they ate on the porch and talked until the darkness swallowed the canyon. Caleb started riding into town more often too, to the general store, to the blacksmith, but always with a stop at Eleanor's shop. Sometimes he had mending to bring. More often, he didn't. He'd just lean against the counter and talk to her while she worked, and she found that his presence didn't disrupt her concentration the way she'd expected. Instead, it settled around her like a warm coat, comfortable and steady. He brought her flowers every time. Never anything fancy, just whatever was blooming along the trails. But he brought them with the same slightly embarrassed expression every time, as if he couldn't quite believe he was the kind of man who picked wildflowers, and she took them with a careful thank you every time, as if she couldn't quite believe she was the kind of woman who received them. Martha Pruitt, of course, noticed everything. "He was in your shop again today," Martha said one afternoon, cornering Eleanor outside the general store. "That's the 4th time this week. He has a lot of mending." "Nobody has that much mending, Eleanor. The man is courting you." "Don't be absurd." "I'm not being absurd, I'm being observational. He looks at you the way my Howard used to look at the dessert table at church socials. Like he wants to get closer, but he's afraid someone will slap his hand." "Martha, and you look at him like you just remembered you're alive, which frankly is the first encouraging thing I've seen from you in a decade." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue and found she didn't have the energy. Martha was many things, loud, nosy, relentless, but she wasn't wrong, and Eleanor was tired of pretending she didn't feel what she felt. "It doesn't matter how I look at him," she said quietly. "I'm 48 years old, Martha. That ship sailed a long time ago." Martha's expression softened, which was rare and therefore alarming. "Eleanor Whitmore, who told you that ship sailed?" "Everyone. The whole town. The Mirror." "The Mirror doesn't know a damn thing about love, and neither does this town. And I say that as someone who's lived here for 30 years and knows exactly how small-minded these people can be. But the town did notice, and the town did talk. Because Copper Ridge had nothing better to do than watch its neighbors and form opinions. And the sight of Caleb Mercer, strong, capable, still handsome in a rough-hewn way, spending time with Eleanor Whitmore, gray-haired, quiet, practically invisible, was the most interesting thing that had happened since Harold Fenton's barn burned down 2 summers ago. It started as whispers, at the general store, at the feedlot, at May's cookhouse where the ranchers gathered in the mornings, over coffee and complaints. "You see Mercer coming out of the widow's shop again? Man needs his eyes checked, or his head. She's old enough to be his. Well, she's old. That's the point. Maybe he feels sorry for her. Some men are like that. Some men are just lonely enough to lower their standards." The comments were never said to Eleanor's face, but they reached her the way all gossip reaches its target in a small town. Through the thin walls of her shop, through the careful pauses in conversation when she walked into a room, through the looks that were a beat too long and a shade too pitying. She felt them like paper cuts, small and sharp, and she hated herself for caring because she'd spent 12 years telling herself she was beyond caring what people thought. One afternoon, she was picking up supplies at the general store when she overheard 2 women talking in the next aisle. She couldn't see them, but she recognized their voices. Clara Hutchins and Dora Mae Swell, 2 of the most prolific gossips in the territory. "It's sad, really," Clara was saying. "A woman her age chasing after a man like that. She should know better." "I heard she rides out to his ranch at night," Dora Mae said, and the word night carried enough insinuation to fill a courtroom. "What kind of example does that set?" "A desperate one. That's what kind." Eleanor stood very still, holding a bag of flour against her chest like a shield. Her face burned, her throat closed. She set the flour down carefully, left the store without buying anything, and walked back to her shop with her spine straight and her eyes dry because she'd be damned if she let anyone see her cry on a public street. That night, she didn't ride out to the ranch. She sat in her back room with the lamp turned low and the flowers Caleb had brought wilting in their jar on the windowsill, and she stared at the wall and thought about all the reasons this was a mistake. She was too old, she was too plain, she was too set in her ways, too comfortable in her loneliness, too afraid of the vulnerability that love required. She'd built a life, a small, quiet, careful life, and it worked. It wasn't happy exactly, but it was safe, and safe had been enough for 12 years. And who was she to suddenly demand more? Caleb came into the shop the next morning. He could tell something was wrong immediately. She could see it in the way his shoulders tightened and his eyes went careful. "You didn't come last night," he said. "I had work." "You always have work. You came anyway before." She kept her eyes on the garment in her hands. "Maybe I'm behind." He stood there for a long time. She could feel him looking at her, and the weight of his gaze was almost unbearable. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was quiet. "What happened?" "Nothing happened." "Something happened. You won't look at me." She looked at him then, and whatever he saw on her face made his jaw tighten. "Who said something to you?" "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me. Tell me." "It doesn't matter because they're right, Caleb." The words came out harder than she intended, edged with something that might have been anger, or might have been fear. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. "Look at me. Really look. I'm not the kind of woman a man like you should be spending his time with. People talk. They laugh. They think you're desperate or crazy or... Do I look like I care what people think? Maybe you should. Why? Because Clara Hutchins has an opinion? Because some rancher at the feedlot made a joke? Eleanor, I've been shot at, thrown from horses, caught in blizzards that lasted a week. You think I'm scared of gossip? I'm not talking about being scared. I'm talking about being realistic. Realistic. He said the word like it tasted bad. Let me tell you about realistic. Realistic is me spending 6 years sleeping in bunkhouses and on the ground and in the back of wagons because I couldn't face a real bed in a real house, because every time I closed my eyes I saw Sarah and the baby we never got to name. Realistic is me coming here and buying a broken-down ranch because I figured if I could fix the fences and the roof, maybe I could fix whatever's broken in me too. And realistic is me walking into your shop and seeing a woman who knows exactly what it feels like to carry grief so long it starts to feel like your own skin, and realizing for the first time in years that I'm not alone in this. So don't you tell me about realistic. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady them. I'm 48, she whispered. I'm 51. So what? People can hang, every last one of them. I didn't ride 1,000 miles and spend every penny I had to start over just to let a bunch of bored housewives tell me who I'm allowed to talk to. The shop was very quiet. Outside, someone was hammering. A horse whinnied down the street. The clock on the wall ticked, ticked, ticked. I'm scared, Eleanor said, and it was the most honest thing she'd said in 12 years. Caleb's face changed. The anger drained out of it, and what replaced it was something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like pain. Me too, he said. You think I'm not? You think I don't lie awake at night wondering if I'm a fool for feeling this way? I'm terrified, Eleanor. I lost everything once, and the thought of going through that again... He stopped, swallowed. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. And if that makes me a fool, then I guess I'm a fool. Eleanor stared at him across the counter, across the pile of someone's unfinished mending, across 12 years of silence and safety and the suffocating comfort of a life lived entirely alone. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear his. She could hear the clock and the hammer and the horse and the whole damn town going about its business, indifferent and cruel and small. Tuesday, she said finally. I'll come Tuesday, and I'll bring cobbler. The corner of his mouth turned up. Not a full smile, just the beginning of one. I like cobbler, he said. I know you do. You mentioned it 4 times. Only 3. 4. I counted. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the silence between them was different now. Not heavy, but warm, like sunlight through a window. He put his hat on, touched the brim the way he always did, and walked out. The bell rang. The shop was empty again, but it didn't feel empty the way it used to. It felt like a room that someone was coming back to. Eleanor picked up the unfinished mending, threaded her needle, and went back to work. Her hands had stopped shaking. The flowers on the windowsill had another day left in them, maybe 2. She'd need to find a better jar, something that held water properly instead of leaking onto the sill and staining the wood. She caught herself smiling and didn't stop it. Outside, the heat pressed down on Copper Ridge, and the dust blew through the streets, and the town went on being exactly what it was, hard and small and unforgiving. But somewhere between the feed store and the vacant lot, behind a faded blue sign that nobody ever bothered to read, a woman was sitting in a narrow shop with a needle in her hand and a crack in her chest where something that had been closed for a very long time was starting, slowly, stubbornly, and against every ounce of her better judgment, to open. She brought the cobbler on Tuesday, just like she'd promised. It was peach, made with the last of the preserve she'd put up the previous fall, and the crust was a little too brown on one edge because she'd been fussing with her hair instead of watching the oven. She carried it out to the ranch balanced on her lap while Biscuit plodded along the canyon road, and when Caleb saw her coming up the path, he walked out to meet her the way he always did, except this time he was wearing a clean shirt and his hair looked like he'd actually used a comb on it, and neither of them mentioned these details because mentioning them would have meant admitting they were trying, and admitting they were trying was still too frightening. They ate on the porch. The cobbler was good. Caleb said it twice, and then said it a third time with his mouth full, which made Eleanor tell him he had the table manners of a barn cat, which made him laugh so hard he nearly choked. "Thomas never laughed at my jokes," she said, and then went quiet because she hadn't meant to bring Thomas into this evening. But Caleb just leaned back in his chair and said, "What kind of jokes did you tell?" "Bad ones, apparently." "Tell me one." "I can't think of any." That's probably why he didn't laugh. She kicked his boot under the table, and he grinned, and the evening settled into the easy rhythm that had become theirs. Half conversation, half silence, both equally comfortable. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the sky turned the color of bruised plums, and the coyotes started their nightly chorus out in the scrubland, and Eleanor realized she was happy. Not content, not managing. Happy. The feeling was so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize it, like hearing a song she used to know played in a different key. The weeks that followed were the best she could remember since before Thomas died. Maybe the best ever, though she felt guilty thinking that and tried not to. Caleb rode into town 3 or 4 times a week now, and he always ended up at her shop, and sometimes he brought her things. A jar of honey from a rancher who kept bees, a piece of quartz he'd found by the creek that caught the light, in a way he thought she'd like, a book of poems he'd bought at the general store and then looked embarrassed about. "You read poetry?" she asked, turning the small book over in her hands. "Sarah used to read it to me. I never understood most of it, but I liked the sound of her voice when she read it, so I figured maybe I'd try again." And I still don't understand most of it, but there's one in there about a field in winter that made me think of you, and I don't know why, so don't ask." She didn't ask. She read the poem later that night, alone in her back room, and she understood why it made him think of her. It was about something beautiful buried under snow, waiting for warmth, not dead, but sleeping. She pressed the page flat with her palm and left the book open on her pillow while she slept. Their evenings at the ranch grew longer. Sometimes she didn't ride home until the stars were thick overhead, and Biscuit was irritated from standing tied to the fence. They sat on the porch and talked about everything. The futures they'd imagined when they were young and stupid, the compromises they'd made, the things they regretted, and the things they didn't. Caleb told her about the months after Sarah died, the drinking, the rage, the night he'd ridden his horse into a snowstorm, hoping the cold would take him, and then hating himself when it didn't. "I'm not proud of that," he said. "You don't have to be proud of it. You just have to be here." He looked at her in the lantern light, and his gray eyes were soft in a way that made her chest ache. "I'm here," he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His scarred fingers closed around hers, and they sat like that without speaking while the lantern burned low and the night sounds filled the canyon. It was the first time they'd touched deliberately, skin to skin, and Eleanor felt the contact travel up her arm and settle somewhere behind her ribs, warm and steady as a second heartbeat. But happiness in Copper Ridge was never allowed to exist quietly. It started with small things. The way conversation stopped when Eleanor walked into the general store. The way women she'd known for years suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. The way the ranchers at May's cookhouse went silent when Caleb came in for breakfast and then started up again in low voices after he passed. Then it got worse. One morning, Eleanor found a note slipped under her shop door. No signature. Just 3 words in a cramped, mean hand. "Act your age." She stared at it for a long time, standing in the dusty morning light with the note trembling between her fingers. Then she crumpled it and threw it in the stove and went to work, and her stitches were uneven for the first time in years because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. A week later, Caleb came into the shop with his jaw set hard and a look in his eyes that was halfway between fury and hurt. "Roy Baskin came by the ranch this morning," he said. Roy Baskin was one of the bigger cattle operators in the valley, a man with a thick neck and thicker opinions who considered himself the unofficial authority on how things ought to be done. "What did he want?" Caleb sat down on the bench by the door, the one where customers waited when Eleanor was busy. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands. "He said he wanted to talk about fence lines. Then he spent 20 minutes telling me I ought to find a more suitable woman." The word hit Eleanor like a slap. Suitable. She knew exactly what it meant. Younger, prettier, less worn. "What did you say?" "I told him to get off my land before I put him off it. Then he said he was just trying to help. And I said if I wanted help, I'd ask someone who had the sense to mind his own business. And he called me a stubborn fool. And I called him something worse. And he left." Eleanor sat down at her sewing table. Her hands were in her lap, motionless. "Maybe he's right." Caleb's head came up fast. "Don't start." "I'm not starting. I'm just saying. You're saying what they want you to say. You're repeating their words like they're yours, and they're not. Eleanor, look at me." She looked at him. His face was flushed, and his jaw was working the way it did when he was trying not to say something he'd regret. "Roy Baskin's been married 3 times, Caleb said. His first wife left him, his second wife couldn't stand him, and his third wife drinks. That's the man you want to take advice from about love? It's not just Roy. I know it's not just Roy, it's the whole damn town. And you know what the whole damn town has in common? Not one of them is brave enough to do what we're doing. Not one of them has the guts to feel something real and act on it. So they sit in their kitchens and their parlors and they pick at us because it's easier than looking at their own miserable lives." He was breathing hard. Eleanor watched him, and beneath the anger she could see something else. Fear. Not fear of the town. Fear of losing her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Promise me." "I don't make promises." "Make this one." She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past, and somebody yelled at a dog, and the ordinary life of the town rolled on, oblivious and grinding. "I'm not going anywhere," she said again, and this time it sounded like a promise, even without the word. But the town wasn't finished with them. The gossip spread beyond Copper Ridge. Women from the outlying ranches and the neighboring settlements started coming to Eleanor's shop, and at first she thought business was just picking up because summer was busy season and people needed mending. Then she realized they were coming to look at her. They'd heard the story. The aging widow and the rancher, the wildflowers, the evening rides. And they wanted to see the woman at the center of it, the way you'd go to a sideshow to see the bearded lady. Some of them were kind. A young woman from Elk Fork told Eleanor she thought it was beautiful, what she and Caleb had, and she hoped to find something like it someday. An older woman from the Miller Ranch brought her a jar of blackberry jam and said, "Good for you, honey. About time someone in this valley had the nerve." But others came to stare, and their stares were sharp, and Eleanor felt them like splinters working into her skin. She heard the whispers at the counter while she measured fabric. She caught the sideways glances while she wrote receipts. She knew what they were thinking because she'd thought it herself 100 times. Who does she think she is? The worst part was that the attention was changing Caleb too. Not his feelings, those stayed steady and clear as canyon water, but his temper. He was getting into arguments at the feedlot, snapping at men who made comments, riding home from town with his shoulders bunched and his fists tight on the reins. She could see the toll it was taking, and it scared her because she knew from experience that pressure like that could crack even the strongest people. "You've got to stop fighting everyone," she told him one evening on the porch. "I'm not fighting everyone, just the ones who deserve it. Caleb, you nearly punched Frank Tillman yesterday. Frank Tillman said you were too old to be riding out to a man's ranch at night. He said it loud enough for the whole feedlot to hear. What was I supposed to do? Ignore him." "I don't ignore things, Eleanor. That's not how I'm built." "Then learn. Because if you get into a real fight, you'll get hurt or you'll hurt someone else. And either way, it gives them exactly what they want. They want us to fail. They want to see us fall apart so they can shake their heads and say, 'I told you so.' Don't give them that." He was quiet for a while. The crickets sang. The lantern flickered. "When did you get so smart?" he asked. "I've always been smart. You just didn't notice because you were too busy being angry." He let out a long breath and rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm tired of it, Eleanor. I'm tired of defending something that shouldn't need defending." "I know. I just want to sit on this porch with you and eat your terrible cobbler. My cobbler is not terrible, and not worry about what some fool at the feedlot thinks about it. Is that too much?" "In Copper Ridge? Probably." He reached for her hand, and she gave it to him, and they sat in the dark and listened to the coyotes and didn't say anything for a long time. And Eleanor thought about how strange it was that the hardest thing she'd ever done wasn't burying her husband or surviving alone for 12 years or building a business from nothing. The hardest thing was sitting on a porch holding a man's hand and believing she deserved to be there. The crisis came in mid-July, on a Sunday afternoon so hot the dogs wouldn't leave the shade. Eleanor was in her shop working on a commission, a wedding dress for a rancher's daughter from the next county, the biggest order she'd had in years, when Clara Hutchins walked in. Clara was a thin woman with a thin mouth and eyes that could cut glass. She was married to the owner of the general store, which meant she had access to everyone's business and the inclination to use it. She stood in the center of Eleanor's shop and looked around as if she'd never been there before, which was a lie because she'd brought her mending every month for the past 8 years. "I'm not here for mending," Clara said. "Then what can I do for you?" Clara folded her arms. "A group of us have been talking, some of the women in town, about you and Mr. Mercer." Eleanor's needles stopped. She didn't look up. And we think it's inappropriate. A woman your age carrying on like this, riding out to a man's property alone at night. People are talking, Eleanor. People are laughing. People have always talked, Clara, and people have always laughed. That's not new. What's new is that you're giving them something to talk about. You used to be respectable." Now Eleanor did look up. "I am respectable. Respectable women don't, well, they don't behave like this. Not at your age. It's undignified." Eleanor set down her needle. She stood up slowly, and something in the way she stood made Clara take a half step back, though she'd never admit it later. "Let me make sure I understand you," Eleanor said, and her voice was very calm, the kind of calm that precedes storms. "You came into my shop, my place of business, to tell me that a group of women have decided how I should live my life, that you've appointed yourselves the judges of my dignity, that a woman who has worked 7 days a week for 12 years, who has never asked anyone for charity or help or a single kind word, who buried her husband and built her life back from nothing, that woman is not respectable enough for Copper Ridge." Clara's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Here's what I think, Clara. I think you and your group should find something else to talk about. Because my life, my choices, and my evenings are none of your concern. And the next time you walk into my shop, it had better be with mending in your hand or don't walk in at all." Clara left without another word. The bell rang behind her with a sharp, offended sound. Eleanor stood in the silence of her shop, and her legs were shaking and her heart was pounding, and she felt sick to her stomach the way she always did after confrontation. She sat back down at her table and picked up the wedding dress and tried to thread her needle, and couldn't because her hands were trembling too badly. She put her head down on the fabric and cried. Not because Clara had hurt her, Clara couldn't hurt her, not really, not anymore. But because she was so tired, tired of fighting, tired of being watched, tired of feeling like she had to justify her right to be alive and wanting something more than survival. That evening, she didn't ride out to the ranch. She sat in her back room with the lamp off and the windows dark and the flowers Caleb had brought dying in their jar, and she thought about what it would mean to end this, to go back to the silence, the routine, the careful emptiness that had kept her safe for so long. It would be easy. It would be painless. She would tell Caleb they'd had a nice time, but it was over, and he would argue and she would hold firm, and eventually he would stop coming to the shop and the town would stop talking and everything would go back to the way it was before. She could do that. She could absolutely do that. She sat in the dark for a long time, running the idea through her mind like fabric through a machine, examining it from every angle. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that wouldn't get her hurt. And then she thought about Caleb's hand closing around hers in the lantern light, and the way he laughed when she insulted his cooking, and the poem about the field in winter, and the look on his face when he said, "I'm here," and she knew, with a certainty that went all the way down to her bones, that she couldn't do it. She couldn't go back. She didn't want to go back. The silence had been safe, yes, but it had also been a grave, and she'd been lying in it for 12 years and calling it a life. She got up. She lit the lamp. She found a clean jar, filled it with water, and went out to the tiny yard behind her shop where a patch of wild sage grew along the fence. She cut a handful of stems, put them in the jar, set them on the windowsill. They weren't much. They weren't pretty the way Caleb's canyon flowers were, but they were hers, and she'd chosen them, and that was enough. She would go to the ranch tomorrow. She would bring food and bad jokes and steady hands and whatever was left of her battered, stubborn, imperfect heart, and if the town didn't like it, the town could choke on its own gossip. Eleanor Whitmore was done being invisible. She went to the ranch the next evening, just like she'd decided, carrying a pot of beef stew and a determination that sat in her chest like a fist. Caleb was on the porch when she rode up, and she could tell from the way he stood, too fast, too stiff, that he'd been worried she wasn't coming. He didn't say that. He just walked out and took Biscuit's reins and helped her down, and his hand lingered on hers a beat longer than necessary, and that was enough. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired. Want to talk about it?" "No. I want to eat stew and sit on your porch and not think about Clara Hutchins for one single hour." "Clara came to see you?" Eleanor handed him the pot and walked past him up the porch steps. "I said I don't want to talk about it." "You just brought her up." "Caleb." "Fine. Stew it is." They ate in silence for a while, and it was a good silence. Not the brittle kind that meant someone was angry, but the soft kind that meant words weren't needed. The sun was going down behind Black Hollow Ridge, painting the sky in shades of rust and copper that made the valley look like it was burning from the edges in. The horses moved in the corral, and somewhere out in the scrub, a quail called its evening song, that quick stuttering whistle that sounded like someone counting. "This stew is better than the last one," Caleb said eventually. "The last one was fine. The last one had too much salt." "Then why did you eat 3 bowls?" "Because I have manners." "You have no manners. You eat with your elbows on the table, and you talk with your mouth full, and last week you wiped your hands on my good tablecloth." "That was a tablecloth? I thought it was a rag." "It had embroidery on it, Caleb. I stitched that pattern myself." "Well, it was a real pretty rag." She tried not to smile and failed, and he saw it and looked pleased with himself in that quiet way of his, the way a man looks when he knows he's won something small but important. They settled into the evening the way they'd settled into all their evenings, slowly, without rush, letting the conversation find its own shape. They talked about the ranch, about the new fence posts Caleb had put in along the north pasture, about the heifer that had gotten through a gap in the wire and led him on a 2-hour chase through the canyon. They talked about Eleanor's wedding dress commission, which was turning out beautifully despite the fact that the bride kept changing her mind about the neckline. "She wants lace now," Eleanor said. "She started with plain cotton, then switched to satin. Now she wants lace. I've torn out more stitches on that dress than I've put in." "Sounds like she doesn't know what she wants." "She's 22. Nobody knows what they want at 22. "Did you?" Eleanor thought about it. "I thought I did. I wanted a husband and a house and a garden with roses. I got the husband. Never got the house. We lived above the shop, and the roses died the first summer because I forgot to water them. That's a sad garden. It was a terrible garden. Thomas said I could kill a cactus, and he wasn't wrong." Caleb laughed, and the sound rolled across the porch and out into the cooling air. "Sarah was the same way. She had a window box in our kitchen in Durango, tried to grow herbs. Everything she planted turned brown inside a week. She said the herbs were being spiteful." "She sounds like she was funny." "She was. Funnier than me, which isn't hard. She used to say I had the sense of humor of a fence post." She wasn't wrong about that either. He kicked her boot under the table the way she'd kicked his weeks ago, and they grinned at each other in the fading light, and for a moment the world felt small and close and exactly right. But the world never stayed small for long. The storm came 3 days later. It had been building all week, the air heavy and electric, the sky going yellow-green in the afternoons, the kind of pressure that made animals nervous and people short-tempered. Eleanor had watched the clouds stacking up over Black Hollow Ridge from her shop window, and she knew from 12 years of frontier living that when the sky looked like that, trouble was coming. She was at the ranch when it hit. She'd ridden out Tuesday afternoon, earlier than usual, because Caleb had asked her to look at some curtains he'd found in the attic. Old things, moth-eaten and dusty, that he thought she might be able to salvage. She was sitting in his kitchen examining the fabric when the first crack of thunder split the air like a gunshot. "That's close," Caleb said, looking out the window. Within 20 minutes, the world disappeared. The rain came down in sheets so thick Eleanor couldn't see the barn from the kitchen window. The wind hit the house broadside, rattling the windows in their frames and driving water under the door. Lightning turned the sky white every few seconds, and the thunder came so fast it was almost continuous, a rolling, slamming percussion that shook the walls. "You can't ride home in this," Caleb said. "I know. It might last a while. The way the sky looked this morning, this could go 2-3 days." She looked at him across the kitchen table. The implication hung in the air between them. She would be here, in his house, alone with him, for days. In Copper Ridge, that was the kind of thing that ruined reputations. In Copper Ridge, it was practically a confession. "I'll take the upstairs bedroom," she said. "You stay down here." "I was going to suggest exactly that." "Good. Good." They stood there for an awkward moment. And then the wind tore a branch off the cottonwood tree outside and threw it against the side of the house with a bang that made them both jump. And the awkwardness broke because there were suddenly practical things to do. Buckets to put under the leaks, windows to check, horses to settle in the barn. The first night was restless. Eleanor lay in the upstairs bedroom, which smelled like dust and old wood and still had Walt Dawson's faded curtains on the window, and listened to the storm beat against the house. She could hear Caleb moving around downstairs, the creak of floorboards, the clank of the stove door as he fed the fire. She lay on her back with her eyes open and thought about how strange it was to be in a man's house again, to hear another person breathing under the same roof, to know that if she called out, someone would answer. She didn't sleep much. She didn't think he did either. By the second day, the storm had settled into a steady, relentless pour that turned the yard into a lake and the canyon road into a river. There was no going anywhere. The world had shrunk to the size of Caleb Mercer's house. And within that house, there were two people who had spent years building walls around themselves and were now trapped together with nowhere to hide. They circled each other carefully at first, the way animals do when they're sharing territory. Caleb made coffee. Eleanor found flour and salt in the pantry and made biscuits. They ate in the kitchen without talking much, listening to the rain, and the silence was comfortable enough, but there was something underneath it. A current running just below the surface, and they both felt it. It was Eleanor who broke first. They were sitting in the front room. Caleb had a fire going in the stone fireplace, and the light was orange and unsteady. And she was looking at the empty walls, the bare floors, the absence of anything personal in the entire house. No photographs. No books except the one he'd bought for her. No sign that a person lived here rather than camped here. "You haven't unpacked," she said. Caleb looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been here months, and this house looks like you moved in yesterday. Where are your things? Where are your, I don't know, your belongings? Things that matter to you?" He was quiet for a while. The fire popped and hissed. Rain hammered the roof. "I don't have much," he said. "Everyone has something." "Not everyone." He stared at the fire. "After Sarah died, I got rid of most of it. Sold what I could, burned some things, left the rest behind when I sold the ranch." "Why?" "Because keeping it hurt worse than losing it. Every time I looked at her things, her books, her clothes, that damn window box, it was like the wound opened all over again, so I cut it all away. Figured if I didn't have anything to remind me, maybe I'd stop remembering." "Did it work?" "No." A bitter half laugh. "You can burn every photograph and throw away every dress and sell every piece of furniture, and it doesn't make a bit of difference because the memories aren't in the things. They're in you. They're in the way you reach for a coffee cup and remember how she held hers. They're in the sound of rain because she liked rain. They're in every stupid, ordinary moment of every day, and you can't burn those." Eleanor felt something crack in her chest. Not break, crack, like ice on a river in spring, shifting, giving way. "I kept everything," she said. "Thomas's things, his watch, our wedding photograph, his coat that still smelled like sawdust for years until it didn't anymore. I kept it all in a tin box under my bed, and I never looked at it, and I never threw it away, and I don't know which is worse. Getting rid of everything like you did, or keeping everything and being afraid to open the box. Maybe they're both the same thing, Caleb said. Maybe they're both just ways of not dealing with it. Maybe. The rain kept coming. The fire burned. They sat on opposite sides of the room, and the distance between them felt enormous and paper-thin at the same time. I'm going to tell you something, Caleb said, and his voice had changed, lower, rougher, like he was dragging the words up from someplace deep. Something I haven't told anyone. Eleanor waited. The night the baby died, the night Sarah died, I wasn't there. I was out on the range, moving cattle ahead of a storm. By the time the rider found me, it had been over for hours. She was gone. The baby was gone. And I wasn't there. His hands were gripping his knees, the scarred knuckles white. The midwife said it happened fast. Complications. Bleeding. She said there was nothing anyone could have done, but I don't know that. I'll never know that, because I wasn't there. Caleb, I was 4 miles away, chasing cattle through mud, and my wife was dying, and my son was dying, and I wasn't there. And every day since then, every single day for 9 years, I've carried that. The guilt of it, the what if. What if I'd come back earlier? What if I'd hired another hand and stayed home? What if I'd been holding her hand when it happened, instead of sitting on a horse in the rain? His voice had gone tight, controlled, the way a man's voice goes when he's trying very hard not to fall apart. Eleanor watched him from across the room, and she understood. Not just his pain, but the specific particular shape of it. The guilt of the living. The impossible burden of having survived. Thomas asked me to stay home the morning he got sick, she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, distant, like someone else was talking. He said he didn't feel right. He said his head hurt, and could I stay and make him soup? And I said I had work to do, and I'd check on him at lunch. She paused. The fire crackled. By lunch, he had a fever. By evening, he couldn't stand. By the second day, he didn't know who I was. And for 9 days, I sat next to him and watched him die and thought, if I had stayed that morning, if I had listened, if I had made the soup and put my hand on his forehead and said, let's get you to the doctor instead of worrying about hemming somebody's curtains, you couldn't have known. Neither could you. The words hung between them, simple and devastating. Neither could you. The mutual absolution of two people who had carried the same impossible weight for years and never found anyone who understood the shape of it. Caleb looked at her across the room, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't try to hide it. I thought I was done, he said. After Sarah, I thought my heart was just finished, like a clock that runs down. I figured I'd buy this ranch and fix it up and live here alone until I died, and that would be enough. And then I walked into a sewing shop and met a woman who insulted my table manners and had the steadiest hands I've ever seen, and was so stubborn she wouldn't admit she was beautiful, even when it was obvious to everyone with eyes. Eleanor's breath caught. Don't say things like that. Why not? Because I'll believe you, and then I'll expect it, and then you'll stop saying it, and I'll be disappointed. I won't stop saying it. Everyone stops eventually. Not me. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made the room feel very small. Not about this. Not about you. The rain hammered the roof. The fire threw shadows on the walls. Neither of them moved. On the third night, the storm reached its peak. The thunder was so close it shook the dishes in the kitchen cabinets, and the lightning came in continuous flashes that turned the darkness into something sharp and stuttering, like the world was being lit by a lamp with a broken wick. Eleanor was standing at the upstairs window, watching the storm tear across the valley, when she heard Caleb's footsteps on the stairs. He stopped in the doorway. She could see his reflection in the dark glass behind her, and he looked like a man who'd made a decision and was terrified of it. Eleanor. She turned. He was holding something in his hand. A ring. Small, gold, worn thin with age. He held it the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable, balanced on his palm like it might fly away. This was my mother's, he said. It's the only thing I didn't burn or sell or leave behind. I kept it because I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me always hoped I'd need it again. Eleanor stared at the ring. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. I know this is crazy, he said, I know it's too fast and too much, and the town will lose its mind. I know you're scared, and I'm scared, and neither of us has any business feeling this way at our age. But I love you, Eleanor. I love you in a way I didn't think I was capable of anymore, and I'd rather be a fool with you than a wise man without you." He knelt, not gracefully. His right knee popped, and he winced, and he had to grab the doorframe to steady himself. And he looked up at her with those gray eyes full of terror and hope and something so raw it hurt to see it. "Marry me," he said, "not because it makes sense, not because it's practical. Marry me because life is short and lonely and brutal, and we've both spent enough of it alone." The thunder cracked so close the house shuddered. The lightning turned the room white. And Eleanor Whitmore, standing barefoot in an old nightgown in a stranger's house during the worst storm the valley had seen in years, looked down at the scarred, stubborn, imperfect man kneeling in front of her and felt the last wall inside her chest collapse. "Your knee is going to give out," she said, and her voice was shaking. "I don't care about my knee." "You will tomorrow." "Eleanor, answer me." She reached down and took his face in her hands, her steady, capable seamstress's hands, and held it. His stubble was rough under her palms. His eyes were wet. He was shaking. "Yes," she said, "but get up before you hurt yourself." He got up, and the ring went on her finger. And it was a little loose because his mother had smaller hands, and he said he'd get it sized, and she said it was fine. And they stood in the upstairs bedroom of a half-fixed ranch house, while the storm raged outside and held each other without speaking for a long time. Then Eleanor pulled back and looked at him with an expression that was half tears and half something fiercer. "We're going to tell them," she said. "Tell who?" "Everyone. The whole town. We're not hiding this. We're not sneaking around. We're not waiting for permission. We're going to ride into Copper Ridge and tell them to their faces." Caleb stared at her. "In the storm?" "When the storm breaks. First thing, we ride in together." "They'll talk." "They're already talking. Let them talk about this." He looked at her, this gray-haired woman in her nightgown with a loose ring on her finger and a storm in her eyes. And he started to laugh, not the quiet, careful laugh he usually gave, but a full, open, reckless laugh that filled the room and drowned out the thunder. "You're something else, Eleanor Whitmore." "I know," she said. "Now go downstairs before this gets improper." He went downstairs, still laughing, and Eleanor stood at the window and watched the storm spend itself against the mountains. She turned the ring on her finger. It caught the lightning and flashed gold, then went dark, then flashed again. She was terrified. She was trembling. She was 48 years old and engaged to a man she'd known for 3 months, and the entire town was going to think she'd lost her mind. She didn't care. For the first time in 12 years, Eleanor Whitmore was not thinking about what she stood to lose. She was thinking about what she'd already lost by being afraid. All those years of silence and safety and careful, quiet dying. She was done with that. She was done with being invisible and reasonable and small. She was going to walk into the center of Copper Ridge with this man beside her and this ring on her finger, and she was going to dare any single one of them to tell her she didn't deserve it. The storm broke before dawn. The sky cleared. The morning came up sharp and clean over the ridge, the air washed anew, the canyon still dripping. Eleanor put on her boots and her coat and walked downstairs, where Caleb was already saddling the horses. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at him, the scarred, imperfect, stubborn man who had somehow found her behind the counter of her dusty little shop and seen something worth kneeling for, and she nodded. "Let's go." They rode into Copper Ridge side by side, their horses' hooves squelching through the mud the storm had left behind. The town was still dripping. Water ran off the eaves in silver threads, and the main street was a mess of puddles and ruts and debris. A broken shutter here, a downed branch there, a chicken coop that had blown halfway across the road. People were coming out of their houses to inspect the damage, blinking in the sharp morning light, and one by one they stopped what they were doing to watch the widow Whitmore and the rancher Mercer ride down Main Street together at 8 o'clock in the morning, both of them coming from the direction of the canyon road, both of them wearing yesterday's clothes. Eleanor felt every single pair of eyes. She felt them on her back, on her face, on the ring that glinted on her left hand when Biscuit shifted and the sun caught it. Her stomach was a knot and her mouth was dry, and she wanted very badly to turn around and ride back to the ranch and hide for the rest of her life. But Caleb was beside her, and his jaw was set, and his back was straight, and when she glanced at him, he glanced back and gave her a nod that said, "Keep going," and she kept going. They stopped in front of the general store. Not because the general store was significant, but because it was the center of town, the place where people gathered, the spot where news traveled fastest. Caleb dismounted first and came around to help Eleanor down. His hand was steady. Hers wasn't. Martha Pruitt was standing on the boardwalk with a broom in her hand, staring at them with her mouth open. "Morning, Martha," Eleanor said. Her voice came out louder than she intended, but she decided that was fine. Loud was fine. "Eleanor." Martha's eyes dropped to the ring. Her broom hit the boardwalk with a clatter. Are you?" "We're getting married," Caleb said. Flat, simple, the way you'd say the sky is blue or the well needs fixing. Martha let out a sound that was half gasp and half laugh, and all Martha. "Well, it's about damn time." Behind her, the town was gathering. Harold Fenton came out of the feed store. The blacksmith stopped hammering. Clara Hutchins appeared in the doorway of the general store with a face like she'd swallowed vinegar. Roy Baskin was across the street loading supplies into a wagon, and he stopped with a sack of grain on his shoulder and stared. Eleanor felt all of them. She felt the judgment and the shock and the whispered calculations. 3 days at the ranch, alone, in a storm. And she stood there and took it because she was done running from looks. She was done shrinking. "We wanted everyone to know," she said, and her voice carried down the street further than she thought it would. "We're getting married, soon, and you're all welcome to come or not come, and either way it's happening." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that sits on a town like snow. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A horse stamped in the mud. Somewhere, a door creaked. Then Martha Pruitt crossed the boardwalk in 3 steps and wrapped Eleanor in a hug so fierce it knocked the breath out of her. "You brave, stubborn woman," Martha said into her ear. "You beautiful, brave, stubborn woman." And the silence broke. Not all at once, and not all kindly. Some people clapped. Old Ruth Hennessy, who ran the boarding house and had buried 2 husbands of her own, wiped her eyes with her apron and said, "Good for you, honey," in a voice thick with tears. The blacksmith tipped his hat. A young cowhand Eleanor didn't know let out a whoop that scattered the chickens. But others turned away. Clara Hutchins disappeared back into the store without a word. Roy Baskin dropped his grain sack into the wagon, climbed up, and drove off without looking at them. A cluster of women near the horse trough exchanged glances and drifted away, their silence louder than any insult. Eleanor watched them go. It hurt. She'd known it would, but knowing didn't help. She stood in the mud in her wrinkled clothes with a loose ring on her finger and a brave face that was cracking around the edges, and she let it hurt because pretending it didn't would have been a lie. "That went well," Caleb said dryly, and she almost laughed. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Eleanor's life. The announcement split Copper Ridge down the middle in a way that nothing had since the water rights dispute of '82. People took sides, and the sides were surprisingly uneven. The supporters were mostly the people Eleanor hadn't expected, the older women who'd lost husbands, the younger couples who thought it was romantic, the ranchers who'd worked alongside Caleb and respected him even if they didn't understand his choices. Martha Pruitt appointed herself unofficial wedding coordinator without being asked and showed up at Eleanor's shop every other day with ideas and opinions and unsolicited advice. "You need a reception. You can't just get married and go home like it's an errand." "I don't want a reception, Martha." "Nobody wants a reception. You have one anyway. That's how it works." "Where would we even have it?" "The Grange Hall." "I already talked to Bernard about it." "You already—" "Martha, I didn't ask you to." "You didn't have to. That's what friends are for." The opponents were louder. Roy Baskin organized an informal boycott, which amounted to a handful of ranchers agreeing not to attend and making sure everyone knew about it. Clara Hutchins stopped bringing her mending to Eleanor's shop entirely, which Eleanor discovered she didn't mind at all. Dora Mae Swell told anyone who'd listened that the whole thing was an embarrassment to the town, and several of the more conservative families made it known that they found the situation unseemly without specifying exactly what about it was unseemly, because specifying would have required honesty, and honesty would have meant admitting they were just uncomfortable with the idea of a middle-aged woman wanting something for herself. The cruelest blow came 2 weeks before the wedding. Eleanor was in her shop, working on her own wedding dress. She'd decided to make it herself because that was what she did. She made things, she fixed things. And if she was going to walk into a room full of people who thought she was foolish, she was going to do it wearing something she'd built with her own hands. The dress was ivory cotton, simple and clean, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that fell just above her boots. No lace, no frills, just good fabric and good stitching. It was the most personal thing she'd ever made, and she worked on it late at night when the shop was closed, sewing by lamplight with a concentration that bordered on obsessive. She was pinning the hem when the door opened and Frank Tillman walked in. Frank was Roy Baskin's foreman, a thin, sharp-faced man with a permanent sneer and the kind of casual meanness that passed for humor among men who had never been challenged. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Frank, I'm closed. Won't take long, just wanted to let you know what folks are saying." "I know what folks are saying. I've been hearing it for months. Not this. This is new." He picked at a splinter on the doorframe, casual, unhurried. "Rumor going around that Mercer's only marrying you because he needs someone to cook and clean and he can't afford to hire help. That it's not love, it's, what's the word, convenience. That he looked at you and saw a housekeeper with a sewing machine." Eleanor's hands stopped. The pin she was holding pricked her thumb, and a bead of blood appeared, bright red against the ivory fabric. "Get out of my shop, Frank. Just passing along what I heard. Figured you'd want to know." "Get out!" He shrugged, touched his hat in a mocking imitation of Caleb's gesture, and left. The bell rang behind him, and the sound was ugly. Eleanor looked down at her thumb. The blood had stained the fabric. A tiny spot, barely visible, but she could see it. She pressed her thumb against her apron and sat very still and breathed carefully through her nose because if she didn't control her breathing, she was going to cry, and she was so tired of crying. The rumor spread fast, the way poison spreads through water. Within days, it had reached every corner of the valley. Eleanor heard it in fragments, at the general store, at the feedlot, in the careful pauses of women who came to pick up their mending and couldn't quite meet her eyes. Convenience. Housekeeper. Practical arrangement. The words were designed to strip the love out of what she and Caleb had built and replace it with something transactional and sad. And the worst part, the part that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her narrow back room, was that a small, vicious voice inside her own head whispered, "Maybe they're right." She knew it was irrational. She knew Caleb loved her. She'd seen it in his eyes when he knelt during the storm. She'd felt it in the way he held her. She'd heard it in every word he'd ever said to her. But 12 years of loneliness and invisibility had left marks deeper than she'd realized, and the rumor found those marks and dug into them like a blade into old scar tissue. She didn't tell Caleb. She should have, but she didn't. Instead, she pulled away in small ways, cutting their evening shorter, keeping more space between them on the porch, finding excuses not to ride out to the ranch. She told herself she was busy with the dress. She told herself she was tired. She told herself a lot of things that weren't true. Caleb noticed, because Caleb always noticed. "You're doing it again," he said one evening, standing in her shop while she pretended to organize thread. "Doing what?" "Pulling back, building walls. The same thing you did when Clara got to you." "I'm not building walls. I'm organizing thread." "Eleanor, look at me." She didn't want to. Looking at him made it harder to doubt. And right now she needed to doubt, because doubt was familiar, and familiar was safe. "Who got to you this time?" "Nobody." "Don't lie to me. We're past that." She put down the thread. She gripped the edge of the counter. "Frank Tillman came by." Caleb's face went dark. "What did he say?" "It doesn't matter what he said. It matters because you're standing behind that counter like it's a fortress and you won't look at me. What did he say?" She told him. She told him about the rumor, the convenience, the housekeeper, the practical arrangement. And she watched his face go from angry to hurt to something she couldn't read, something that looked almost like despair. "And you believe that?" he said. "After everything, you believe that?" "I don't know what I believe. I know what I feel. And what I feel is, I feel like maybe this is too much. Maybe we're fighting too hard for something that shouldn't be this hard. Everything worth having is hard. You know that." "I know that in my head. But my head isn't the problem, Caleb. The problem is the part of me that still thinks Clara and Roy and Frank are right. The part that looks in the mirror and doesn't understand why you'd choose me." Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated it. She hated the weakness, the vulnerability, the raw exposed nerve of it. She was a grown woman. She was supposed to be past this. Caleb came around the counter. He stood in front of her, close enough that she could smell the sage and wood smoke, and he took her hands in his scarred ones. "Listen to me," he said. "I'm going to say this once, and I need you to hear it. Not just the words. I need you to hear it." She looked up at him. "I didn't ride 1,000 miles to find a housekeeper. I can wash my own dishes and cook my own terrible food and sweep my own damn porch. I came here because I was looking for a reason to keep living, and I found one, and she had gray hair and steady hands and the sharpest tongue in the territory, and I fell for her so hard it scared me half to death." "Caleb, I'm not done. You want to know why I chose you? Because you're real. Because you don't pretend. Because when you laugh, it sounds like you mean it, and when you're angry, you say so, and when you're scared, you stand up anyway. Because you've been through the worst thing a person can go through, and you're still here, still sewing, still putting lavender in people's packages, even though nobody ever thanks you for it. That's why I chose you. Not convenience, not loneliness. You." She was crying. She couldn't help it. The tears ran down her face and dripped off her chin, and she didn't wipe them away because her hands were in his, and she didn't want to let go. "I'm a mess," she said. "I know, so am I. We match." She laughed through her tears, an ugly, snotty laugh that was nothing like the polite sound she usually made. And he pulled her against his chest and held her while she cried it out, all of it, the doubt and the fear and the bone-deep exhaustion of caring what people thought. The morning of the wedding, Eleanor woke before dawn. She lay in her narrow bed in the back room of her shop and stared at the dress hanging on the door. Ivory cotton. Simple. Clean. One tiny blood stain on the hem that she'd never been able to get out, so she'd embroidered a small flower over it, a single red bloom against the white, the only decoration on the entire dress. She liked it. It felt honest. A flaw turned into something beautiful. Or at least into something intentional, which was almost the same thing. She got up, washed her face, put up her hair. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and tried to see what Caleb saw. The gray hair, the lines around her mouth, the tired eyes. She didn't see beauty. She didn't see ugly either. She saw a woman who had survived, and maybe that was enough. Martha came at 7 with a basket of wildflowers and a hairbrush, and an energy that was frankly exhausting. "You're not wearing your hair like that," Martha announced. "What's wrong with my hair?" "It's too tight. You look like a school teacher. Let me fix it." "I am not letting you—" "Sit down, Eleanor." Eleanor sat down. Martha brushed out her hair and pinned it loosely, letting some of the gray strands fall around her face, and when she was done, she stepped back and said, "There," with the satisfaction of an artist surveying a finished painting. "You look like yourself," Martha said. "That's better than looking like anyone else." The wedding was at 10 o'clock in the small wooden building at the edge of town that served as both courthouse and community hall. It wasn't fancy. There were no decorations except the wildflowers Martha had scattered along the aisle and a few ribbon bows someone had tied to the ends of the benches. The justice of the peace was old Judge Harmon, who was half-deaf and had to be told twice what names to use. Eleanor stood outside the door in her ivory dress, with the embroidered flower on the hem, and listened to the murmur of voices inside. Martha was beside her, holding a bouquet of sage blossoms, an Indian paintbrush that Caleb had picked that morning. "You ready?" Martha asked. "No." "Good. You'd be a fool if you were." Eleanor took the bouquet. Her hands were shaking. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear the bench creaking inside and Judge Harmon clearing his throat. "Martha," she said, "what if they're right? What if I'm too old for this?" Martha looked at her with an expression that was fierce and tender and slightly impatient. "Eleanor Whitmore, you have spent 12 years being too old for things, too old to laugh, too old to want, too old to live. If you are too old to get married, then you are too old to do anything, and I refuse to accept that, and so should you." The door opened. The room was half empty. Roy Baskin and his people had kept their word. Their benches sat vacant, a visible accusation, but the other half was full. Ruth Hennessy was there, dabbing her eyes already. The blacksmith was there with his wife. Young couples from the neighboring ranches were there, and a few older women who'd come alone and were sitting very straight and looking determined. Martha's husband, Howard, was in the front row, holding his hat in his lap and trying not to look emotional, which he was failing at. And at the front of the room, standing beside Judge Harmon in a clean black coat that didn't quite fit across the shoulders, was Caleb Mercer. He turned when the door opened. He saw her, and the look on his face, the naked, unguarded, overwhelming look on his face, was worth every whisper, every rumor, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt she'd ever suffered. She walked down the aisle. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 20 feet, but it felt like the longest distance she'd ever covered. She held the wildflowers against her chest and kept her eyes on Caleb and tried not to trip on the hem of her dress. And halfway there, her vision blurred because she was crying again, and she didn't care. She reached him. He took her hand. His was shaking too. "You made that dress," he said quietly, not a question. "I did. It's beautiful. It has a blood stain on the hem. I know. I can see the flower you put over it." He squeezed her hand. "That's my favorite part." Judge Harmon cleared his throat, adjusted his spectacles, and began. The ceremony was short and simple, the way frontier weddings were. No music, no poetry, just the plain words of commitment spoken in a plain room by two people who meant every syllable. When the judge asked if anyone had cause to object, the room went tight. Eleanor felt the silence like a held breath. She didn't look at the empty benches. She looked at Caleb. Nobody spoke. "Then by the authority vested in me," Judge Harmon said, "I pronounce you married." Caleb kissed her. It wasn't elegant. He bumped her nose with his, and someone in the back laughed, and Eleanor's bouquet got crushed between them. But it was real and warm and slightly clumsy, and she felt it all the way to her bones. The room erupted. Martha was crying openly. Ruth Hennessy was clapping. Howard Pruitt was blowing his nose into a handkerchief. The blacksmith's wife let out a whoop that rattled the windows, and someone, Eleanor never found out who, threw a handful of dried wildflowers into the air. They walked out of the courthouse into the morning sun, hand in hand, married, and Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor Mercer now, though the name felt new and strange like a coat she hadn't broken in yet, stood on the boardwalk in her ivory dress with the embroidered bloodstain and looked out at Copper Ridge and felt something she hadn't felt in 12 years. She felt like she belonged somewhere. Not to the town, not to the people who judged her or the ones who'd cheered for her. She belonged to herself, and she'd chosen to share that self with a man who saw her clearly and loved her anyway, and that was the only kind of belonging that mattered. Caleb stood beside her, squinting in the sunlight, holding her hand in his scarred one. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, trying it out, "don't get used to it. I'm keeping Whitmore for the shop." "Fair enough. And you're still not allowed to wipe your hands on my tablecloths. We're married now. I think tablecloth privileges come with the deal." "They absolutely do not." He grinned at her, that wide, face-cracking grin she'd only seen a handful of times. And she grinned back, and they stood there in the mud and the sun like two people who had just gotten away with something impossible and couldn't quite believe their luck. The first morning Eleanor woke up in the ranch house as Caleb's wife, she lay still for a long time and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of her new life. The creak of the house settling, the horses moving in the corral. Caleb downstairs banging around the kitchen with the graceless energy of a man who had never learned where anything belonged. She heard a pot clang against the stove, then a muttered curse, then the smell of coffee drifting up through the floorboards. Burnt, too strong, the way he always made it. She stared at the ceiling. It was a different ceiling than the one she'd stared at for 12 years. Higher, wider. A water stain in one corner shaped vaguely like a boot. She was married. She was living in someone else's house. She was 50 miles from the narrow back room where she'd spent the last decade sleeping alone, and the distance felt enormous, like she'd crossed an ocean in the night. "Coffee's ready," Caleb called from downstairs. "If you want to call it coffee, I think I killed it." She got up. The first months were harder than either of them expected, and neither of them had expected easy. Living alone for years does something to a person. It calcifies habits, turns preferences into requirements, makes the small negotiations of shared life feel like territorial disputes. Caleb left his boots in the middle of the kitchen. Eleanor reorganized his pantry without asking. He couldn't sleep with the window open. She couldn't sleep with it closed. He ate too fast. She took too long. He forgot to tell her when he'd be late coming in from the pasture. And she forgot that she wasn't the only person in the house anymore and startled every time she turned a corner and found him standing there. "You don't have to jump," he said one afternoon when she nearly dropped a plate of biscuits because he'd come in through the back door without warning. "Then stop sneaking up on me." "I wasn't sneaking. I was walking. In my own house. Through my own door." "Our house." "Our door." "Right. Our house that I'm apparently not allowed to walk through without announcing myself like a town crier." They fought. Not big, dramatic fights, the kind that shake walls and end with someone slamming a door, but the small, grinding friction of two people who had forgotten how to share space. They argued about the stove temperature and the order of morning chores, and whether the cat that showed up on the porch should be fed or chased off. They argued about money. Eleanor insisted on contributing to the ranch expenses from her sewing income, and Caleb said that was foolish because they were married now, and what was his was hers, and she said she didn't want what was his. She wanted to pay her own way, and he said that was pride talking, and she said pride was all she'd had for 12 years, so he'd better learn to live with it. "You're the most stubborn woman on this frontier," he told her after one of these arguments, "and you are the most pig-headed man. We're a perfect match." But the fights never lasted. They couldn't, because underneath the friction was something solid, a bedrock of mutual recognition, the shared understanding of two people who knew what real loss felt like and weren't willing to lose each other over a window or a cat. Eleanor moved her sewing business into the ranch house. She set up in the front room near the big window that faced the canyon, and for the first time in years she had real light to work by. Not the dim, dusty glow of her old shop on Main Street, but clean morning sun that poured across her work table and made the fabric glow. She bought a new sign. Whitmore Tailoring. By appointment. She hung it at the end of the ranch road, and customers came, more than before actually, because the story of the wedding had traveled further than she'd imagined. Women rode out from towns she'd never heard of, some of them genuinely needing alterations, and some of them just wanting to see the woman who'd caused such a commotion. Eleanor didn't care about their reasons. She took their money, did good work, and let them stare if they wanted to. A few of them left as friends. Most left as satisfied customers. That was enough. The ranch itself was slowly coming together under their combined stubbornness. Caleb fixed the barn roof and rebuilt the north fence line and got the well pump working properly for the first time since Walt Dawson died. Eleanor planted a garden along the south side of the house. Vegetables, not roses, because she'd learned her lesson about roses. The vegetables didn't all survive, but enough of them did that by late summer they were eating their own tomatoes and squash and beans, and Caleb said it was the best food he'd ever tasted, which was a lie, but a kind one. They found their rhythm. It took time, weeks, then months, but gradually the friction smoothed into something workable. He learned to announce himself when he came through the door. She learned to leave his pantry alone. They compromised on the window, open in summer, closed in winter, cracked on the nights in between. The cat stayed. Caleb named it Trouble, which Eleanor said was redundant because all cats were trouble, but she fed it scraps under the table when she thought he wasn't looking, and he pretended not to notice. Copper Ridge changed around them, slowly, the way towns do. Roy Baskin sold his operation the following spring and moved to California, and with him went the hardest edge of the opposition. Clara Hutchins never brought her mending back to Eleanor, but she stopped making comments in public, which was its own kind of surrender. Frank Tillman got fired from his new job for drinking and left the territory entirely, and nobody missed him. The people who'd boycotted the wedding didn't apologize, people rarely do, but they stopped avoiding Eleanor and Caleb in public, and over time the avoidance gave way to nods, and the nods gave way to greetings, and the greetings gave way to the ordinary, unremarkable acceptance that passes for tolerance in small towns. Eleanor didn't forgive them exactly, but she stopped needing to. Forgiveness, she decided, was overrated. Moving on was enough. It was Martha Pruitt who brought them Lily. Martha showed up at the ranch one October afternoon with a look on her face that Eleanor recognized immediately. The look Martha wore when she'd already made a decision and was just going through the motions of consulting other people. "There's a girl," Martha said, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of Caleb's terrible coffee. 7 years old, her parents died of typhoid on the way through the pass, both of them, 2 weeks apart. The wagon train left her at the settlement in Elk Fork, and the settlement doesn't want her. They're talking about sending her to the orphanage in Helena. Eleanor set down her sewing. And you're telling me this because? Because you've got room, and because that girl needs a home, not an institution. Martha, we've been married less than a year. We're still figuring out how to live together without killing each other. Perfect time to add a child then. Takes the focus off your own nonsense. Caleb was leaning in the kitchen doorway, listening. He hadn't said anything, which was unusual for him. Eleanor looked at him. What do you think? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see something working behind his eyes. Something old and painful and complicated. A boy they never got to name. I think we should go meet her, he said. They rode to Elk Fork the next morning. The settlement was a sorry collection of buildings at the base of the pass. A trading post, a few cabins, a corral. The girl was sitting on the steps of the trading post when they arrived, alone, wearing a dress 2 sizes too big and boots that were falling apart. She had dark hair cut unevenly, like someone had gone at it with dull scissors, and eyes that were too old for her face, the eyes of a child who had seen things children shouldn't see. Her name was Lily, and she didn't say a word for the first 3 days. Eleanor understood silence. She'd lived inside it for 12 years. She didn't push, didn't prod, didn't ask questions Lily wasn't ready to answer. She gave the girl the upstairs bedroom, the one where Caleb had knelt during the storm, and she made her a new dress from a bolt of blue cotton, and she fed her 3 meals a day and let her be quiet. Caleb was different with the girl. Careful. Gentle in a way Eleanor hadn't seen before, a tenderness that came from somewhere deep and old and grieved. He showed Lily the horses and let her feed them apples from her palm. He built her a small chair for the porch so she could sit with them in the evenings. He didn't try to be her father. He just tried to be present, and the trying was visible and clumsy and heartbreaking to watch. On the 4th day, Lily spoke. She was sitting at the kitchen table while Eleanor worked on a commission, and she'd been watching Eleanor's hands move for a long time. The way children watch things that fascinate them, with total absorption and no self-consciousness. Can you teach me? Lily asked. Eleanor looked up. Teach you what? Sewing, the way you do it, with the little stitches. Eleanor pulled a chair next to hers, handed Lily a needle and a scrap of cotton, and showed her how to thread the eye. Lily's first stitches were huge and crooked, and she pricked her finger twice and said, "Ow," both times without crying. And Eleanor told her that was exactly how her own first stitches had looked, which was true, and that it got easier, which was also true. Did your mama teach you? Lily asked. She did. Lily was quiet for a moment. My mama didn't sew. She cooked. She made the best cornbread in Missouri. That's what my daddy said. I bet she did. She's dead now. I know, sweetheart. Are you going to die too? Eleanor put down her needle. She looked at this 7-year-old girl with the 2 old eyes and the uneven hair and the enormous courage it had taken to ask that question. And she said the only honest thing she could. Someday. Everyone does. But not today. And not for a long time if I have anything to say about it. Lily considered this. Okay, she said, and went back to her stitching. It wasn't much. It was everything. Lily grew into the family the way plants grow into rocky soil. Stubbornly, unevenly, with roots that found purchase in unlikely places. She was a difficult child in some ways, wary of affection, quick to anger, prone to nightmares that left her screaming in the dark. She tested Eleanor and Caleb constantly, pushing boundaries, picking fights, waiting to be sent away because that was what her 7 years of experience had taught her to expect. They didn't send her away. They weathered the tantrums and the silences and the nights when Eleanor sat on the edge of Lily's bed and held her while she shook. They weathered the morning Lily threw a plate at Caleb's head because he told her to wash her hands before breakfast, and the afternoon she ran away to the canyon and didn't come back until dark, and the week she refused to speak to either of them for reasons she never explained. She's testing us, Caleb said one night, standing at the bedroom window while Eleanor brushed out her hair. She wants to know if we'll give up. Will we? You know the answer to that. I want to hear you say it. No, we won't give up. Not on her, not ever. And they didn't. And slowly, in increments so small they were almost invisible, Lily began to trust them. She began to laugh at Caleb's bad jokes. She began to lean against Eleanor's shoulder during their evening sewing lessons. She began to call them by their first names instead of ma'am and sir, which wasn't the same as mama and daddy, but was close enough, and Eleanor took it and held it and didn't push for more. The years passed the way years do on the frontier, hard, slow, marked by seasons rather than dates. Eleanor's sewing business grew until she had more work than she could handle alone, and Lily, who had inherited Eleanor's steady hands, if not her patience, became her apprentice. Caleb's ranch prospered. The herd grew, the fences held, the well pump stopped fighting him. They added a room to the house for Lily, and then another room for Eleanor's workshop, and then a covered porch that wrapped around two sides of the house, because Caleb said every good ranch needed a porch you could walk around. Eleanor started writing in the evenings. Not fiction, not poetry. She had no gift for either, and no patience for pretending she did. She wrote in a leather-bound journal that Caleb gave her for their 3rd anniversary, and she wrote plainly, the way she spoke, about their life. About Thomas and Sarah and the children they'd lost and found. About the storm and the ring and the morning they rode into town. About Clara Hutchins and Roy Baskin and the cruelty of small places and the larger cruelty of believing you don't deserve happiness. She wrote about Lily's first stitch and Caleb's terrible coffee and the cat named Trouble, who slept on the porch railing and hissed at strangers. "Who's this for?" Caleb asked one night, watching her write. "I don't know, maybe nobody." "You're writing a whole book for nobody." "It's not a book. It's just a record, so someone knows." "Knows what?" She thought about it. "That it's not too late. That's the thing people get wrong, Caleb. They think there's a deadline. They think love has an expiration date, like milk or medicine. They think you get one chance, and if you miss it, that's it. Game over. Spend the rest of your life sitting in a back room feeling sorry for yourself." "That's a lot of thinking." "I'm a lot of woman." "You certainly are." She kicked him under the table. He caught her foot and held it, and they sat like that, ridiculous and comfortable, while the lamp burned and the journal lay open and the words waited to be written. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in late November, 31 years after the afternoon she'd first mended Caleb Mercer's shirts. She was 79 years old. She died in the upstairs bedroom where he'd knelt during the storm, with the window cracked open the way she liked it, and the quilt Lily had made pulled up to her chin, and Caleb's hand holding hers. It was quiet. There was no drama, no final speech, no sudden revelation. She'd been sick for a few weeks, a cough that wouldn't quit, then a tiredness that settled into her bones and wouldn't leave. The doctor came from town and said what doctors always said, which was that there wasn't much to be done. And Eleanor told him she'd never expected much from doctors anyway, which made Caleb laugh even though he was crying. Lily was there. She was 38 now, with steady hands and a sewing business of her own, and a husband who adored her, and 2 children who called Eleanor Grandma Ellie and Caleb Pop, and thought they'd always been a family, because as far as they knew, they had. In the last hour, Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at Caleb and said, "You need a haircut." "I know. And your coffee is still terrible." "I know that too. I love you, even though you ruined my tablecloth." "I love you too, even though you reorganized my pantry." She smiled. It was small and tired and real. She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and that was the last thing. The pressure of his fingers against hers, the warmth of it, the steadiness. The whole town came to the funeral. Not just the people who'd supported them, everyone. The children of the people who'd boycotted the wedding stood in the cemetery with their hats off and their heads bowed. Clara Hutchins' granddaughter brought flowers. The blacksmith's son rang the shop bell 31 times, 1 for each year of the marriage. Caleb stood at the graveside and didn't speak. He'd been asked to say something, and he'd tried, but the words wouldn't come. Martha Pruitt, 82 years old now, still loud, still fierce, still the best friend Eleanor had ever had, stood beside him and held his arm and didn't let go. It was Lily who spoke. She stood in front of the town with her mother's journal in her hands and said, "Eleanor Whitmore Mercer was not a perfect woman. She burned toast. She couldn't grow roses. She held grudges longer than she should have, and she never learned to make decent coffee, and she reorganized other people's things without asking because she thought she knew better, and half the time she was right about that, but the other half she wasn't. She was stubborn and proud and scared of more things than she ever let on, but she was brave. She was the bravest person I ever knew. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was afraid every single day of her life, and she kept going anyway. She taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something matters more than the fear. And for Eleanor, what mattered was love. Caleb lived 4 more years. He carried Eleanor's journal everywhere, in his coat pocket, in his saddlebag, on the kitchen table where she used to sit and write. He read from it sometimes, to visitors, to Lily's children, to anyone who sat on the porch long enough to listen. Not the whole thing, just pieces. The parts that mattered. He told them about the afternoon a woman with gray hair and steady hands had mended his torn shirts and charged him 75 cents, and didn't smile until the 4th time they met. He told them about wildflowers from the canyon trail, and peach cobbler that was a little too brown on one edge. He told them about a storm that shook the mountains, and a ring that was a little too loose, and a morning ride into town that changed everything. And when they asked him how he'd found the courage to love again, to risk again, to kneel on a bad knee in a stranger's upstairs bedroom and offer his whole broken heart to a woman the town thought was invisible, he always said the same thing. Courage isn't something you find. It's something you decide. You decide that the person in front of you is worth more than the fear inside you. You decide that being alive means actually living, not just surviving. You decide that it's never too late, because the only thing that makes it too late is believing it is. He died in his sleep on a spring night with the window cracked open and the cat asleep on the foot of the bed. Lily found him in the morning with the journal open on the pillow beside him, turned to a page near the end where Eleanor had written, in her plain, steady hand, "I was invisible for 12 years. Then a man walked into my shop with torn shirts and storm gray eyes and saw me. Not the widow, not the seamstress. Me. And I thought, this is what it feels like to come back from the dead. Not all at once. Not with trumpets or fireworks. Just quietly, like the first warm day after a long winter, when you step outside and realize the cold is gone, and you survived it, and the world is still here waiting for you." They buried him next to her on the hill above the ranch, under the cottonwood tree where they used to sit on summer evenings and watch the light drain out of the canyon. Lily carved the headstone herself. Both names, both dates, and underneath them a single line that she'd found in the journal and knew her mother would have wanted. It is never too late. The ranch passed to Lily, and Lily passed it to her children, and the children grew up hearing the story the way frontier children hear all stories, around kitchen tables and on porch steps, in the quiet hours between work and sleep, told and retold until the details blurred but the feeling remained. The feeling of 2 people who had been broken and lonely and afraid, who had found each other in a dusty sewing shop in a hard little town, and who had decided, against all reason, against all judgment, against the cruel consensus of a world that believed love belonged only to the young and the beautiful, that they deserved one more chance. And Copper Ridge remembered them, not as the scandal they'd once been, not as the gossip or the spectacle or the controversy. The town remembered